Machine learning, artificial intelligence, algorithms, and other rapid changes in technology are disrupting and creating new industries at unprecedented rates. They're affecting the types of work we do and altering workplaces. What impact will these changes have on Africa and its youthful population? Africa, the #1 workforce of the future, is the topic for discussion on this panel moderated by Nozipho Mbanjwa at the World Economic Forum on Africa in Durban. Her guests are Acha Leke, Senior Partner McKinsey & Company, Kian Gohar, Executive Director, Innovation Partnership Program, Judy Dlamini, Executive Chairman, Mbekani Group, and Peter McClary, Deputy CEO, Barclays Africa. First up for discussion, the topic of skills development.
It's actually not just the youth that's going to enter the job market, but even the people that are currently in jobs will be redundant unless, as companies, we reskill them, we retrain them. We actually not in an era where just because you started as a doctor or because you started as an HR practitioner, that's where you end. So you have to multi-skill yourself all the time, and companies actually have to drive that to make sure that the employees are multi-skilled. Lastly, gender. Gender is big for me. That's why I released the book recently on Equal but Different. If you look at the number of people that Acha was saying are unemployed, I guarantee you that the majority of those people are women. Women are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than men. If you look at South Africa, and you look at, we talk about the 15 to 34-year-olds that are unemployed. And if you dig down, it's actually mainly women. And if you go further, black women form 49.1% of those, the youth that is unemployed but not at school also. So it's actually, we need to devise interventions to ensure that the gender is included at all levels.
So Peter, we've added gender mainstreaming and skills for the future that really goes to the heart of how education is not only delivered but how it's designed as a starting point. From the perspective of the private sector, 2-3 big ideas that you think really need to be tackled.
Access is perhaps for me the first one. So in other words, how do we get people who come through this pipeline that we speak to, and I suppose there are 2 pipelines, to have access to the workplace where they get into what I will call experiential learning. In other words, demystify the world of work, but more importantly, give people the real exposure in order to experience the world of work. So that's the one part. The second, of course, and I take a leaf out of part of what Judy has spoken to, which is in those creative teams that you create, they almost become virtual teams. They can't be any longer static. So you will not only work in Department A. If you look at many of these new millennial companies, they work across different sectors of the organization. So being able to put together, I almost want to call them virtual teams. Sounds fancy, it's not that fancy. You get a whole bunch of people together sometimes. But again, with very clear outputs in terms of what it is they begin to think about creating. You know, that whole Microsoft Garage project that talks to how do you begin to put different types of people into environments that begin to create new solutions. And that's the next. The third, and sometimes I think we ignore this, it really is about what kind of role models you also create. And role models aren't necessarily, and I speak within the private sector, but also outside the private sector, they aren't necessarily only those who sit at what people might call the top of the tree, but role models that work through different parts of whether it's school, whether it's communities, etc., because they create positive reinforcing and models that allow you to want to do differently for where you are and where you want to be.
Kian, I see you nodding vigorously on the point of role models, so I'll come back to you on that. But actually, before we go there, I want to come back to this idea of 50 Harvard-like institutions in the next couple of years.
Every year.
Every single year. 50 Harvard-like institutions in every single year. Now, if we just plug into the political rhetoric, it doesn't matter which market you're looking at in Africa. The investment in education is always clear. The commitment to education is almost clear. What is not allowing us to move towards this vision, and what would we need to do fundamentally differently if we're going to create 50 Harvard-like institutions every single year?
Yeah. Well, first, we're not, because we're not going to be able to do that. But I think what we're not doing enough is thinking very differently about how to bring education to the masses, right? And I know there are a number of programs, people have started thinking about it, but I think we go down the same path of, the educator is the sole source of knowledge. We don't think how to leverage technology to scale things up. We really think that, the students have to sit in the classroom. So how do you think differently? And I'll give you some examples. So we started something called the Africa Leadership University. There we want to do it completely differently. The idea is to say, how do you train somebody in 3 years? How do you do that? And the idea is to actually build 20 campuses across Africa. We've done 2, one in Mauritius and one in Kigali now. And the idea is very much education to employment. So right. In a year, you spend 8 months on campus and 4 months in a job. Right? So by the time you're done with the 3 years, you've spent a year in a job. Back to Peter's point around, getting these internships to learn very practically how to do these things. The second thing we think about is what's important, I think, you talked about, John, is learning how to learn, right? By the time you learn something today, it'll be obsolete before you probably finish your degree, right? So a lot of the focus is on learning how to learn, such that I know how to apply that to a number of different situations. The third is, again, part of the challenge of the 50 universities is you just cannot find enough PhD professors. You just cannot find enough, right? They just don't exist. And so if you rely on that model, we're never going to get there. So how do you build a model that's very different, that doesn't rely on the PhD professor? How do you leverage, again, learnings from other institutions and bring it into the classroom? How do you we have, people finish undergrad, people finish ALA, went to university, finished undergrad, and they're teaching, one of our classes, and they're doing extremely well. And by the way, the issue with professors is they're there to do research, not to teach, right? So that's part of the issue. So those are some of the innovations we're trying. That's just one example, right, to hopefully address that problem.
Just a quick follow-up on that. As you begin to speak about the model that African Leadership University has used and touching onto Peter's point of giving them an experience of being in the world of work, how are you fundamentally de-risking young talent? Because the private sector might have some reservations about taking on young people that don't necessarily have the skills and put them in front of and behind their products and services to their clients. So how are you making Peter happy with the decision of bringing a 17-year-old into the bank?
Well, it's hard to make Peter happy, as I've learned. But no, so the idea there is what we do is, and that's what you're seeing more and more, is back to my point around the disconnect between education institutions and the corporates, is that we bring them to the table and say, let's design the curriculum together. Let's design the curriculum with the insurance companies, let's work with you all to design the insurance curriculum. With the financial services, let's design the curriculum. And once we've designed that, and actually we even leverage some of the staff to help teach part of this curriculum. And in exchange, and now these students are trained and are ready for the job. And there's more of a off-take type contract to say you'll then, it's not a guarantee, but right. You'll then hire these students once you finish with them. So we bring them to the table and actually co-design the curriculum with them.
So certainly some ideas already coming through for the panel discussion. Remember, if you've just joined us at home, you can be a part of this conversation. The hashtag that we're using today is Future Skills, and you can follow the handle at Barclays Africa. Kian, I want to come back to data, and in particular, you spoke about data mining. I think one of the most often phrases that are being said now is that if you don't have digital skills, you're going to become an observer of the new economy that is emerging. But let's bring this back to Africa, where we're still talking about dysfunctional labor markets in the main. How do we leverage data so that we can have better forecasting, better planning for the types of skills that the labor market of the future is actually going to need?
So I think one of the most fascinating things that people aren't talking as much about is that over the next 3-4 years, we're going to have pretty much low bandwidth connectivity free around the world, thanks to organizations like Facebook, Google, Amazon, who are putting together low Earth satellites to essentially create this connectivity. So I think one of the biggest challenges that Africa faces is this access to bandwidth and connectivity for the first part. And we're going to have that problem solved in the next 3 to 4 years. So once you now have several hundred million new people online able to access this data, how can you leverage the intelligence of the crowd? How can you leverage people who are brilliant everywhere and not just sitting in Silicon Valley or in Johannesburg, but who might be sitting in a rural part of Kenya. So I think that's one of the most powerful things that we're going to see over the next 3-4 years is this emergence of hundreds of millions of people who will have access to bandwidth to then be able to engage in this digital economy. One of the things that Acha mentioned, which I think is phenomenal, is this what he's doing at the African Leadership Academy and building more of those. So one of the most powerful things that we're seeing in Silicon Valley is we're seeing this divergence between formal education and individuals who are looking for job-skilled specific education. So instead of going to, let's say, a formal institution, they're going to for-profit or non-profit organizations educationally to learn specific skills that will then translate into this digital data economy. Organizations such as General Assembly or Udacity or Coursera. So we're seeing people create these microdegrees, these micro-credentials, which are different than these formal institutions we still need, but we need to complement that to essentially allow people to get this formal education, but also learn these specific skills that they can take from job to job to job, where the reputation matters more, rather than, let's say, the Harvard that you went to.
So let me be a little bit difficult and maybe ask the question whether we are slightly at risk of leaving some parts of Africa behind, given the fact that our levels of development are quite significantly different. And we talk about a digital economy, but we're talking about that against the backdrop of a reality of 54 fundamentally different states. So how do we reconcile the fact that in some markets we're still fighting for access to higher education, we're still fighting for bringing down the cost of education, and yet we're also now talking about micro degrees and doing things fundamentally differently? Is there an approach that you think should be considered if we're going to move in the right direction, irrespective of where we are in the journey?
I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution for all of Africa, because you're coming from 54 different countries, whether some are very industrialized, some are more agrarian. And I think we have to essentially try all options. So in Silicon Valley, organizations that are most successful are the ones that are constantly experimenting. And so we need to basically try all options and see what works best in one region versus the other. We need to have these formal institutions that Acha mentioned in terms of building. We need to have these digital factories that are training people individually to get online. And we also have one thing that you mentioned, which I really loved, was this lifelong learning. We can't just focus on the youth. We also have to focus on some of the older people who are in this economy. And one model which has just started, which I really like, is in Singapore. They've just launched this new program called Future Skills, where essentially they're giving every Singaporean citizen over the age of 25 the equivalent of $350 in credits to use in coursework development online every year. And so this is tremendously powerful to get people who are past the formal stages of adult education to develop this kind of skill set. So to answer your question, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I think it's a try-everything solution. One of the things that we are working on, the XPRIZE Foundation, which I also represent, is we've created a $15 million global learning competition funded partially by Elon Musk. And the idea is to create this artificial intelligence software that will help take children in rural Africa from 0th grade standard to 3rd grade standard literacy autonomously, using the power of artificial intelligence and tablets to augment the work of the teachers and the schools. Because we can't build schools fast enough, we can't hire teachers fast enough. We have to leverage these new exponential technologies to essentially get everyone on board. So there are so many things that we need to do, and we have to do all of them.
I think we're at the tipping point of a potential deal. So if you can match $50 million, Peter, and then we can make sure that we've got a fund that both Acha and Judy can tap into to bring those technologies into their schools. I'm going to come back to productivity versus creativity, because I think that's a really powerful concept. But Judy, I want to come back to the other thing that really keeps you up at night, which you've already mentioned, and that is, of course, the dysfunctionality in terms of not seeing the women coming through the ranks. Now, if we are going to ensure that the exclusion of women in the future workforce is not going to be a pattern that's going to be replicated going forward, how do we break the chain? How do we break the pattern that has set itself fundamentally to see something different in the future?
I'll just take up what Peter said in terms of needing role models in communities, in business, in whatever sphere that the youth are exposed to. And that actually talks to what Nunu said when she spoke about the girl child entering the STEM courses but not finishing. But the challenge is that those that do, because there are those that do, one, but also if you look at just the makeup of the students that qualify for junior degrees and honors degrees globally and in this country, it's no less than 60% that is women. And that does include STEM cells, maybe not as much, but we are actually seeing traction there. And if we actually have this workforce, bright women, and we actually don't create positions for them, it's a problem. It's actually a problem for the economies. And in terms of how do we address that, it's a problem that actually requires different spheres, not just the corporate, yes, the government, the society, because if you recall, especially in our communities, I'm talking about the community that I come from, where you actually have a stereotype that this is what a girl is expected to do. And actually I like one of the quotations by Ngozi, who says, as women, you actually told that you can be ambitious, but not too ambitious. You should do well, successful, but not too successful. So there is this holding back of more than 50% of the population just because of the stereotypes, the prejudices that we have as society. So it starts there when we raise the kids, that you actually expect the same of each one of them. They have to be the best that they can be. It's not about beating or being beaten by a boy, or it's just being the best that you can. It's fine if the boy is doing well or the girl is doing well. It shouldn't be based on gender. So I think the way to tackle the problem of inclusivity when it comes to gender requires each and every sphere of the population. If you go to the corporate world now, because as I always say, men are in charge, and if we are to be inclusive, if we are to break the barriers, you actually need men leading that charge, because they're in charge. And more importantly, there are men who are doing the right things. So it's important that you acknowledge those men and you actually reward them for doing the right thing, because if you actually just shout from the mountains as women, as women's groups, it's actually not going to change the status quo. So I really believe that's one of the things I did when I was the chairman of ASPEN, where I actually had just one award that recognized a man, and it had to be a man who actually had opened up and empowered, whether it's skilling, whether it's promotion, women. So, yeah, I think.
There are other numbers that you've put on the table, Peter. In particular, it was 2 million versus 7 million in terms of jobs created versus jobs potentially destroyed going forward. We're talking about an increasingly automized, increasingly digitized world. Maybe the first part of the question is help us understand the social costs of automation. And the second part of the question is, can we do anything about the balance between job creation and job destruction?
And absolutely right, because that's the gap, right? So as you automate, by way of example, a back office where you had 70 people, okay, you reskill all of them, but you only employ 10, you got a net 50 who potentially are therefore out of work, and therefore you've got to start thinking further down the value chain about what else it is in society that you've skilled them for. Because it won't always be the young ones, it could be middle-aged or old guys like myself, right? So you've got to start thinking about that. And if I could talk a little more practically around that, if you look at institutions such as ours, where we have the obligation to make sure we completely understand our clients, where they get their source of income from, how we therefore bank them, etc. The social and emotional intelligence that is required in order to ensure that you can take that customer along with you in a culturally or other sensitive manner is absolutely critical. Yeah? This isn't about tick this form and sign here. It is about, this is why I'm asking you to do this, and how do we get from A to B to C practically. In one of our branches in Ghana, and this is not an advert, one of our branches in Ghana. Ghana is a cash-based economy to a very large extent. But one of the things we've sought to do is, as they come into the branch, and we've tried to change the nature of that branch, we help people and we teach them how to deposit their cash through these fancy ATMs, but more importantly, we keep a track of that individual until they're comfortable. So every time they come to the very same individual who taught them how to do it last time, because it's about building that relationship that gives them that sense of ownership, belonging, and comfort, so that they'll get to the point where they no longer have to come to Peter and ask him, how do I deposit that? But the value I've created for that customer, while complying with all of the other regulations that I have, I've completed that circle. So many of the skills we teach people going forward won't only be around the digital world.
Right.
You use the digital world as the enabler, but it allows you to change the way in which you socially interact, and therefore you begin to close that gap. That will shift skills in many respects away from what we might call the center or the office into communities and beyond that. I can go on and on. I won't.
Kian, is there a correlation there between the distinction that you introduced us to between creativity and productivity?
Yeah, so I think you can be creative in many ways in terms of communication, in terms of empathy, in terms of social skills. And I think when automation continues and takes out a lot of these back office operations, we're going to have the kinds of jobs that require those skill sets like empathy, like collaboration, like communication, and creativity, very broadly spoken. So creativity doesn't just mean designing art or being an artisan. Yes, that's one aspect of it. But there are different ways of being creative in this digital economy as well. For example, the future manufacturing, high-level jobs in manufacturing aren't in building stuff or assembling things. Rather, they're in the higher-order level work of the supply chain, or rather the R&D, or rather the design aspect of it. So I would encourage Africans to think about, if I'm going to be in the future manufacturing, how can I be on the more higher-end skills part of that, which involves creativity. And then if you look at, for example, data, so data doesn't just have to be numbers. Well, we've had, in the last couple of years, 500% increase in demand for data analysts, but we've also had 2,500% increase in demand for data visualization. So to be able to think creatively isn't just in terms of physical products, but rather you can use that in a digital world. And I think this key point that you made around collaboration and communication is what's going to help create jobs and also keep people gainfully employed with purpose.
Acha?
Yeah, I think one other creative approach that we should leverage more is peer-to-peer learning, right? So we talked a lot about the professor, but it's interesting. I remember at ALA once we actually didn't have a computer science teacher. We had a number of students who wanted to study computer science. And so they found a course online. That was the first time. We got them together. They learned about it. And at the end, we asked this girl from Morocco, what's her favorite class? And she said, computer science. And we said, well, there was no teacher, right? But she learned a ton from her peers. She's today at Stanford studying computer science, right? Who knows where she's going to end up? And so, there's a lot of research that shows that you learn a lot more when you have to teach it to somebody else, right? So in addition to all of this, I think a lot more peer-to-peer learning in the new models of what we try to develop will be quite important.
So I'm anxious to open up the conversation and to get our live audience to contribute. But before we do that, Acha, I just want to stay with you and perhaps pull back a little bit. If we go back to the reality of the composition of African markets, the informal sector is by far perhaps much bigger than the formal sector. So as we move forward, are we saying that the explosion in the youth population is going to broaden and deepen the informal sector, or are we going to see an evolution of formalization across African markets, and what does that mean for where the jobs of the future will come from?
Well, not necessarily, right? So I think if you start from the number, I said around 250 million vulnerable employed, right? All in the informal sector. And the reality is, we're not growing formal jobs fast enough, right? We did analysis, look at other countries. Other countries, Brazil, South Korea at the time, grew formal jobs 3 times as fast as we did. But even if we did that, you'll still have hundreds of millions in vulnerable employment. So 2 things that are critical. One is entrepreneurship, right? Is not expecting them to have, to find a job. It's teaching them to be entrepreneurs so that they can create jobs for themselves and create jobs for others, right? So that's one big area that's critical. And the other area is social safety nets. We need to make sure we take care of them. People talk about universal basic income now. Is that the right thing? Is it grants? Nobody knows. But we need that. So I think you'll still have a big informal sector, but the thought of, private sector is going to, or government, which is not right, is going to come and create all these jobs. We're just not going to get there. I think entrepreneurship is going to be a big lever to address that.
So, Judy, before we go to break, latching on to the point around entrepreneurship, it's evident that given the number of entrants looking for work, that the public sector and the private sector together can't possibly create all of those jobs. And Acha has put entrepreneurship on the table. This is a concept that we've seen for a long time in across the continent with varying degrees of success. With varying degrees of success. And again, I'm going to ask you to put Peter on the spot, because fundamentally, entrepreneurs are always going to come back and say that it's the credit worthiness that keeps them away from being able to access the funding that helps them get started. How else do we think differently about entrepreneurs and how we support entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs in particular?
I'll actually take it back again to just the education system. We have to teach entrepreneurship as a subject. So by the time they actually come out and come to the job market, they actually understand what it takes to succeed, and they're exposed to entrepreneurial exercises while they're still at high school. How are we going to support entrepreneurs? It's actually a combination of factors. If you look at this country, the South African SME Fund, where you have a collaboration between government and the private sector putting a fund together, but not only that, having the skill set actually of incubating young entrepreneurs that are just coming out, not just giving them money also, but also assisting them to learn the ropes. And in this country, one of the things that we do, we can actually improve on it, is just enterprise development, where you have the corporate sector that ensures that they give funding, but also support in terms of the skilling of the entrepreneurs. But also, again, I'm going to come to what we're doing as a country, where you actually ensure that we support those small businesses when we source, whether it's services or products, but where we are still lacking. I know I'll sound like a pain because I still go back to the women issue. You find that those opportunities more often, they are actually given to men, and women are not given the opportunity in spite of the policies that we actually say, the government puts in place. So I think we have to be mindful of that when we do all these good things, where we support the entrepreneurs, where we actually buy from small entrepreneurs that we support, that we just ensure that women are not left behind, because they tend to be higher in numbers in the space of entrepreneurship, especially at the small medium enterprises.
Well, on that note of not leaving women behind, we're going to take a short break. But when we come back, our live audience here in Durban is going to be contributing to this conversation through questions and answers. And remember, if you're watching from home, you too can be part of the conversation. The hashtag that we're using today is Future Skills, and we're following at Barclays Africa. I'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to the special CNBC Africa broadcast. If you've just joined us, we're in Durban, South Africa, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum on Africa, and we've been having a robust discussion on the future skills that are going to be required to position Africa as the workforce of the future. My panelists have left no issues untouched, and now we're going to open up this conversation and invite our live audience here in Durban to contribute with their questions and answers. We'll be taking 1 or 2 questions from social media as well, so if you'd like to send us a tweet, it's the hashtag is Future Skills, following the handle at Barclays Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for contributing to this conversation. Let's take our first question that's coming from the floor. Madam, kindly please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thanks. I'm Nomvula Makhoto from the Department of Small Business Development. I am thrilled by especially the activism for women economic empowerment. It's a fact that as much as we are talking empowerment, especially of the new young generation, we need to be very careful not to exclude the current generation, particularly women, because as it is right now, especially as a country, we have a backlog in terms of empowering women to be at par with everybody else in terms of economic empowerment. So as we look into the future, we must be careful not to exclude the current generation. But secondly is the issue of innovation. In this country, we have a challenge that we do not have any funding for innovation. You know, we have young people who are coming with very beautiful ideas, but the bouquet of funding in the country, including the banks, Mr. Matlari, unfortunately, it's very difficult for one to access funding for innovation.
Let's take a second question, and we'll take a question right here in the front. Let's get a working microphone. Thank you very much. Madam, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Anne Githuku Shongwe. I'm the representative for UN Women, but I'm also the founder of Afro's Transformational Games. I'm very interested in this subject, and it's something that I have invested many years in. And I think my key question is around, in this space of innovation and creativity, could we dare to imagine that we can create learning using our virtual reality and gamification in ways that actually enables young rural kids to do science, have labs that are created virtually so that we don't have to invest in physical labs if we don't have access to physical labs. Could we imagine that our schools are virtual and, we're gamifying how we think about learning. We're rewarding kids for experiential learning, This is the kind of thinking that I think would shift us. But how do we do that at scale?
Let's take a third question before we come back to the panelists. There is a hand on the side here. Thank you very much, sir. Please go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Dr. John Msabena from the International Labour Organization. We're also very interested in this discussion on the future of work. We are running national dialogues on it, looking at particularly 3 areas: organization and of work in the future, work and society, and we're looking at this also of innovation. My question to the panel, which could help us, is as we look at skills, as we look at gender, as we look at robotization, what about the human being? How are we going to ensure that workers who are human beings and their rights can be maintained and do not find ourselves in a race to the bottom where human beings, you lose that humanity at work? Thank you.
What are your comments to John and his concerns about the human race?
Well, one is, I think it's a very valid concern, right? There's a lot of thinking going into, if we know that this model of economic growth has not worked, inclusive growth, right? We know that, this idea of we're going to grow the pie, and eventually we're going to share the pie. We've seen a ton of pushback on that. And given that we're in Durban, I actually happen to sit on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on economic growth and social inclusion. And one of the big questions we have is, what is a new model of more inclusive growth going forward, right? In the context of robots, in the context of AI, in the context of a bunch of jobs disappearing. And so people are starting to test this idea of universal basic income. Everybody's entitled to an income. And I don't know if that's the answer, by the way, right? But I think we know what doesn't work, and we know that we need to try a bunch of different things. I think it's back to what John said. I think what you're going to find is a number of different pilots to try different ways to make sure that people are still valued, people can still, play a role in society, people can still earn a living, right? Regardless of whether they work or not, if the work is different, right? The other question is, does work have to be how we define it today, right? Mm-hmm. So, can you work, fewer hours? People now in the millennials want to do something completely different, right? So how do you make sure that they're able to do that but still earn a living? So I think UBI is one thing that people are trying, and I think we'll see where it goes.
Kian, let me bring you on Anne's question around the potential to use gamification and virtual reality to offset some of the deficits that we see in rural education. It seems like a no-brainer. What is required to make it happen and make it a reality?
So I think if we're trying to build a 21st century digital economy here, we can't use 20th century educational models. We have to build more schools, absolutely, yes. We need that, brick and mortar, but we need these virtual academies. We need virtual models of learning. And I think the most powerful powerful thing that we can use to access this content is our smartphones. So the vast majority of Africans now have access to smartphones, which is more powerful than what the President of the United States had at his disposal 35 years ago. So if you look at what's coming out in terms of technology around augmented reality using your smartphone, I think this has tremendous possibilities for how we're going to access education and how we're going to communicate with each other in the future. So a very popular game that everybody is familiar with, Pokemon Go, that came out last year, that was the first augmented reality game that we used on a smartphone. Now we are seeing applications of this augmented reality technology being used in smartphones for other uses. So absolutely, I think the power to use this technology to scale exponentially and democratize education where people don't have access to primary school education, I think is tremendous. And let's use what we have, which is this smartphone technology, because that technology in terms of using augmented reality is there.
So let's use what we have to move forward. Judy, one of the questions that came through from Nomvula was around the current versus emerging talent, and in particular her concern that we need to also deal with the backlog. What's your thinking on that, and what does that mean for resource allocation and the allocation of opportunities? Should we be focusing on the backlog, or should we be focusing on the future?
You actually have to do both, because if you look globally, people are living longer. So you cannot ignore the backlog that we have. So we need to do both, but we have to be creative about how we do it, because it actually requires a lot of resources. I think for the people that are already employed, I'll go back to what I've said. Collectively, between the employees and the corporates, we do need to multi-skill them. We do need to, I actually am aware of some companies who actually empower their employees in starting up businesses based on the skills that they have. And so I think I'm not sure if I answer you well, but I think we need to do both. We cannot ignore the backlog. We have to address it.
We cannot ignore the backlog. Yeah. We've got to do both. Let's come to funding for innovation in particular and putting money in the pot, Peter. And again, a question raised by Nomvula.
Yeah, look, and so I'm pleased that people recognize that funding is one of the enablers, but it's beyond that. So what have we done? I'd like to talk about what we do right now. We have a couple of really interesting programs, and I'd like to invite Nomvula to join us down in Cape Town, where we've taken, one of them is called Rises, the other is called Aliens. And you can see where I'm going with this. where from across the continent, and this is the important part, not just from within South Africa, we've looked at young innovators who need not just money, but the kind of environment in which to begin to develop and finesse some of these great innovations that they work with. And we, I think at the moment, at least 10 of those that have just come through. And as we work through with them to refine the IP, the registering of their IP, but also refining that which they do, we almost get them to the stage where they're now ready to talk not only to ourselves as kind of incubators and potential funders, but to third parties who can also come in as funders. There's one that we're running in Ghana at the moment, and it's absolutely clear to us that we have a role to play, but they're talking to the likes of Google and other about how do they partner them and create that. So that's the one area in this new innovative world. The other, of course, is I think it's always important to recognize that funding isn't just about the cash. It's about that entrepreneur knowing that the locus of control over their destiny must start with them. They must be the active driver about, as opposed to externalizing that and saying someone else or something else is going to solve the problem for me. That's not being an entrepreneur. You're looking to be somebody who gets an endowment or a bit of something like that. So you've got to get that starting point being that which I seek to drive, and I completely understand and agree that it's not as simple as saying, well, I can do it on my own. But unless you believe, unless you lead that which you're going to do, The funding is only part of that. We've had the small business organization in this country, if you recall, no, you're too young, about 20 years ago. We've had all kinds of other government-initiated funds.
Yeah.
We've seen lots of funds being set aside. The funding, in some respects, is only but one end of that challenge. It's all of the other stuff. One of my colleagues, Giaubaka, will talk to you about how we create that institutional infrastructure that helps those individuals or groups of individuals drive that destiny. So, A, we fund these great tech stars with interesting propositions, and not all of them will succeed, and will always be the case. B, we look for partnerships that, whether they're in offtake agreements and or other, that's the other bit in it. But I must come back to the locus of control.
Right.
You must feel starts with you. You know, where you were directing everybody here, stop this, do this, set that up. That the locus of control over this sits with you. And that, for me, is one of the core values that we've got to drive in how we approach this.
Is there another question coming from the audience here in Durban? So there's a hand there, and a gentleman here in the front. Final gentleman there. We're going to try and squeeze all four in, and that will be our final round. Let's start right at the back. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Bernard Berger. Just wondered, are we not focusing too much on higher education? Shouldn't there be more focus on vocational training? There's a lot of growth in that segment as people move across.
I work a lot with the arts and education, and I attend events like this, and I hear there's this happening, but in spite of this being called the information age, there's very little information between people who are supporting NGOs, people who are supporting education, people who are supporting vocational training facilities. There's very little information available. And when you hear these kinds of things, you think, how are people going to know who didn't attend this breakfast? So I find that very, very problematic, the lack of information being distributed and making sure that people are in the know. Because sometimes you go and ask for help, and there is help. You just don't know about it. Maybe you're going to the wrong people. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning. It's Priya Hassan from Women of Africa. So my question to everybody is about ownership and accountability. We all talk these wonderful things about entrepreneurship, about contributing to innovation and creativity and education. And I think the real question we've got to ask ourselves as industry leaders is, what have you done today? We need to measure what we do. For example, we are now actively involved on an entrepreneurship curriculum development with South African Technology Network. So I can tell you what it is we're doing. We're moving through gender transformation with the Business Women's Association. But it is a challenge because we have multiple businesses still to run.
Right.
So thank you to the likes of the bankers that support us in our initiatives. But look in the mirror and say to yourself, what have you done today? And please measure it. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is William. I just want to make a comment that, sometimes we think about things in a binary way. It's either going to be humans or machines. Actually, the trend we are seeing is that both machines and humans are going to coexist in a way that we've never imagined before. And that we are going to begin to create an economy that's even going to be larger than the economy we are seeing today. We just finished a research jointly with the WEF around the Digital Transformation Initiative, and we sampled about 1,000 people across the world in terms of where this is going. And there's consensus that the actual size of this opportunity is over $100 trillion. Going forward, right? What I am seeing from an Africa perspective is that, yes, of course, education is very important, but these technologies are going to make accessibility be something else we've never imagined. So really the focus for us is that in order to get to the new workforce and to define new ways of working and to take advantage of these technologies, we should really be focusing on access. Because when you give the young people access, they're going to make magic with that access. We did a simple example: just take computers, dump them in a rural area, give them the internet connectivity. When you get there, they know how to write apps. They're communicating with people in other places. And out of that, we are going to see scaling up of access, and people begin to use these technologies interacting with machines to do things that we have never imagined sitting in this room, all of us together. So I'm saying it's not binary.
Achan, let me start off with you. Perhaps a quick reflection on what William has raised that, about the binary misconception and more towards the coexistence.
Yeah. No, I can't agree more, right? It's absolutely not binary. And I definitely think that technology is fundamentally transforming the way we live, right? If we look at, we did some work, if we look at what the mobile has done to how we operate and exist today, and imagine the impact of the internet. We think the internet could contribute 10% of Africa's GDP over the next 25 years. And that's exactly what's going to happen, right? And so putting that in the hands of people, democratizing access will give people a ton more opportunities, and then, you let it shine. I totally agree with that. Just to pick up on the vocational training, because I couldn't agree more with what he said. Again, like I said, today, if you look at Africans, only about 8% of Africans in tertiary education go into vocational training institutions. We believe that should be 50%. We think it's good to have lawyers and consultants, and it's good to have anthropologists. But at the end of the day, we need to train people to do the kind of jobs that also require. One of the big blocker there is mindsets, actually many of us here, right? Which is, when your child comes and says they want to go into vocational training, how do we think about it? So I think there's a lot of mindset changes that are required, even within the parents and those of us who are in the room, to think through how do you encourage people to go that? How do we view vocational training versus, traditional tertiary education? So that is going to be, that's a big change that needs to happen.
Ken, let's bring in some of your reflections, and perhaps you can also touch in on the question that came from Msizi Gabadeli on Twitter around public-private partnerships, and what are the new partnerships that are going to have to emerge if we're going to create a workforce of the future.
If I can pick up on Archer's comment around this vocational aptitude, I think it's critical, like you said, to get more Africans into vocational training. However, what I'd also say is that while we're getting them in vocational training, we need to also make sure they have high cognitive social functioning skills. Because in the workforce of the future, these vocational jobs are the ones that are most likely to get automated. So we want to help people transfer their social skills from one vocational job to the next throughout their lifetime. So in this context, I think vocational jobs are very valuable, but I also say let's train them with the right high cognitive interactive skills, because that's what's going to help them transition from one vocational job to another throughout their lifetime. I think that's really, really critical. And then to the point that around, I think one of the individuals made around accountability and what are we doing about it, and also how do we spread this information, I think it's really critical not to just be sitting here at the World Economic Forum talking to some of the people who have access to these conversations, but to go home and speak to people in your own community, whether they're school teachers or whether they are your family members or whether they are individuals in the labor force, and start talking to them about these big changes that we're seeing in society, because ultimately we have to bring everyone with us. Otherwise we're going to be living in a society where that's going to have digital refugees, and that's not the kind of society that I think we want to live in, whether it's in Africa or across the developed world.
Judy, your reflections, and perhaps also to bring in the question raised by Aglina, which was around, it's all fair and well for us to have these conversations, but this is quite a small group, an elitist group, if you will. How do we open up the conversation, disseminate the conversations that we're having here, and the significance of that?
Yes. I'll just support what you're saying, Akin, that it's actually our responsibility, each and every one of us, that we actually make this accessible to the communities that we come from, because there is so much inequality. Obviously, there are only a few people that have access to conversations like this, but those people then need to take it back to the communities that they represent, the communities that they come from. Coming to this private-public partnership in terms of education, we are seeing a bit of that, where you have the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector trying to improve quality of education in the public sector. But I think ideologically we're not there yet in terms of doing what you see in America, for instance, the charter schools, where you actually have the private sector bringing the skills that they're good at in terms of managing. And I don't know if Akin, you want to talk about that as to how that is working in America.
So, I mean, I think the public sector education model in the United States is changing dramatically. And it's bringing a lot more accountability to the local regions. And I'm not quite sure how that works in specific contexts of South Africa, but I think those kinds of partnerships are very, very important. So this example that I brought back earlier with the X Prize around global learning, this $50 million prize, we're actually working with the Tanzanian government to experiment around this in rural areas of Tanzania. And they've given it their support. And in Tanzania, you need to have local government support to say, we're going to experiment with this technology and help kids learn using autonomous learning, so that the school teachers are not rebel against this particular technology. So you need to have this balance between what the politicians and the policymakers are willing to support and what the technology is allowing to do. And I think it's different in every single region.
Thank you.
So, Peter, you started off the conversation by speaking about partnerships, and it seems this is the natural end where we're tying up the conversation as well. An opportunity for you to weigh in on the partnership conversation as well as any of the other issues that are raised. Let's also not forget Priya, who spoke about, again, the locus of control that you spoke about, and she distilled it to a single question: what have I done today? What are your views on that?
Yeah. So there are a number of areas, and I'm going to go into an old world that I came out of called the SABC, which, and talk about public broadcasting, partnering with both yourselves, okay, to give access to the kind of content that is here today. And you may say, well, it's exclusive content for now, but the reality is the following. If we use those traditional platforms, actually, and marry those traditional platforms with some of the more modern platforms that come through, whether it's handsets and or other, you begin to disseminate this kind of content in a very, very different way. You suddenly have access not only to 1 million people, but perhaps 10, 15, 20 million people. And I want to start, that kind of partnership does not necessarily only have to be driven with the state, but with other entities that exist out there that allow you to populate those ideas deeper and further across the piece. The next, of course, is that when you talk in the educational sense, people sometimes tend to forget that in many respects, whether it's the private sector or there have been foundations, they funded maths and science classes, they funded all kinds of labs, etc. That's part of partnering institutions in beginning to deliver for a range of people. If you think about research grants tend to come out of the private sector rather more than the public sector in many of the large institutions around the world. So those kinds of partnerships really form a core part of that triumph. The real challenge for me is the social consequences of not getting it right time and time again can be very difficult for us. And hence you see the kind of civil unrest that you see globally when that dissatisfaction kicks in. My firm belief there is that institutions that are transformative and therefore play an almost activist nature never stop trying. So that partnership means that you don't actually give up at that point. If you are transformative, it means you go back into the battle again, whether it's with governments, whether it's with other social partners, and again tackle those issues rather than getting to the point that says it's either Africa rising or hopeless Africa, that old economist dichotomy that we saw a couple of decades ago. So what is it? Partnership means you reinforce yourself and you go back into the battle. You can't afford to give up. You've got to keep going back into that battle, which talks about, so what have we delivered today?
And if I might just add one more thing here about this partnership, is that in this economy, one entity or one organization can't do everything anymore. It can't be the government, it can't be the private sector, it can't be the nonprofit sector. The only way you can leverage your impact is to create these partnerships across a multiple, broad ecosystem. And I think that is critical. It's what makes Silicon Valley successful. It's an ecosystem of partners built on top of each other. And that, I think, is really very, very important for building Africa into this new 21st century economy.
And if I might add quickly, success breeds success. So those role models, be they individuals or those partnerships, as they are successful, you create that momentum. that potentially says, well, I too can begin to be successful in this endeavor.
And as we wrap up this conversation, I'm going to ask a simple task from each of my panelists. The purpose of these conversations is never to try and put all the answers on the table, because we probably just don't have them. But it's to spur more questions and to explore new ways of thinking about the same problems. So I'm going to ask each of you to put on the table one question that you would like the audience to walk away with and to continue to contemplate and to continue to work through. What is the one question that you think we need to work on if we're really going to see young people positioned as the catalysts that are going to be driving digital transformation and economic development on the continent? I'm putting you on the spot, and I'm going to start off with you, Acha. Just one question.
My question would be, how do you leverage technology to democratize access and build skills?
How do you leverage technology to democratize access and build skills? Kian?
Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What vision do you have for that future? And what steps do you need to take backwards from now to the next 5 years to get there?
That's cheating. That's 3 questions, but we'll take it. And Judy, your question.
What would it take in the continent for having ethical servant leadership?
Ethical servant leadership. And Peter, we close with your final question.
What are all of the above me? No. and really, I'm going to go back to that locus of control issue.
Yeah.
So, and that is about how do I take ownership, and I know I need partners to help me, but how do I take ownership of my future as opposed to somebody else taking ownership of my future? I can't afford to be a bystander in this next millennium. I have to take ownership. So how do I take ownership of my future? In small ways or big ways?
And on that note, how do I take ownership of my future so that I'm not a bystander in the new millennium? This is how we close the conversation on future skills here in Durban, South Africa, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum on Africa. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa.